I've been looking at for quite some time now a kind of a last days teaching that didn't center on signs. We pay attention to signs, but centered more on our assignment. You know, what are we to be about these last days? And so in order to do that, in order to discover God's will, I've discovered that you ever heard of macroeconomics, economics? If you studied economics, there's macroeconomics and there's microeconomics. Macro is more or less looking at for example, the American economy in the light of our values, of being a constitutional republic, the free market system. That's looking at a macro version. Then you start getting down to the micro. In other words, in light of our values, in light of who we say we are, how do we narrow that down into a micro, application? And I found out that in God's economy, that you have to look at macro first. What is God doing? We want to start in 1 John. Let's take 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18 is where we're gonna start off. We're going to lay the context of the last days. Okay? In 1 John 2:18, John says, "Dear children, this is the last hour. And as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour." Now I'm reading from the 1984 NIV. I don't know how long I've had this Bible, but my wife keeps saying, "You need a new Bible." And I don't know, it's been decades, and I'm putting it together with duct tape and everything. I've glued it, I've done everything I can. And she keeps getting me Bibles, and somebody moves the chapters around or the books around or something. I don't know what it is. I just can't read them. So I just keep this. And it needs to be bigger print, Tom. Right. But I know this one. All right. Now here's my thinking. If John was in the last hour, we got to be in the last few minutes. What are we talking about? Days, but we call them the last days. Now, when you're talking about the last days, I think biblically, I think you're talking about a time frame that goes from the ascension of Christ to his second coming. In other words, we were in the last days the minute Jesus ascended back up into heaven. Now, over the next several weeks, we're going to take a look. I'm going to concentrate in the New Testament, making some references to the Old Testament, because Jesus and some of them make references to the Old Testament. And I want you to know, this is not something that's going to be, all right, we're going to put together a chart about what's happening when, and we're going to get in discussions about pre-trib and mid-trib and post-trib and premillennial, amillennial, rapture here, coming there. I'm going to make some statements, and I'm going to be honest with you, I kind of lean toward pre-trib, millennial. I kind of lean that way, but I don't have anything. This can be so divisive with people that I don't. I've been criticized. I've been told by some, "You're a pan-millennialist, that everything's just going to kind of pan out." I said, if you want to call me that, that's fine. Because to be quite frank with you, God did not put me on the planning committee. I'm not on the membership committee. I don't know whose destination is what and where. God didn't put me on the membership committee. God didn't put me on the The planning committee, I have no clue about what's really seriously. I have so many friends that have so many different views on the last days that I just believe that we should be looking at what is God doing, and don't get stuck in signs. But we should be looking for our assignment. You know, God, what are you doing in the last days, and what's my part? What's our part in it? But God did put me on one committee. He put me on the preparation committee. I believe just as John the Baptist was preparing the way for the first coming of Christ, that we are preparing the way for the second coming. That's really what I believe. And that if we can learn to couch, say, day of hope. In other words, pray and say, God, if you are doing this, which I believe he is, God, if we can put this in last days context, I think it gives more importance to the event itself. Because as we see it in context of what God is doing. And that's just an example because that's what's coming up. We see the context. The context of the last days, they started at the ascension, I believe, and they end with the second coming of Christ. Okay? So, where do you start then? Where would you start looking at the last days? Well, I think a good place to start is Matthew 24. Guys, I have so many people, so many friends with so many differing views on eschatology or the study of last days that there's divisions with some people. I know some people that are so bent on whatever they believe is going to happen that they don't talk to people that have other. You guys experience that?
I have a really good friend who is dead set on the fact that Christ has already come back and we're living in post. Yeah. It's crazy. And you're like, what?
Well, you know, we're going to look at that. How I don't think that's possible.
Right.
But hey, well, you know what's going to happen, Todd? I think I'm going to get to heaven, and I have a phrase that I say when I find out something maybe that I was wrong about. I go, well, I'll be doggone. I bet you when I get to heaven, that's going to be the most common phrase coming out of my mouth. Well, it really was that way? Boy, I missed that. I'll be doggone. You know, a lot of people today are concerned about science. Did you know that the disciples beat us to the punch? They were the first ones to be concerned about it with Jesus. So if you look at chapter 24, verse 1, Jesus left the temple and was walking away with his disciples. Walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another, and every one of them will be thrown down. Every one of them. You know, he's talking about. Now, let's talk about that temple for a second. Okay, we're looking at the second temple. The first temple was Solomon's temple. It was destroyed in 586 BC by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? Then this one, they started building this one back, I want to say maybe within 10 years. Matter of fact, it was such a magnificent structure. Just understand there were several buildings, but the temple itself was 500 yards long and 400 yards wide. And it was such a miraculous thing with gold and, ruby. I mean, this thing was just something to behold. Matter of fact, this temple has stood for so long that in Jewish law, it was blasphemy to speak against the temple. Now, the reason I want to bring all that up is because Jesus, in the Greek language here, when he says in verse 2, do you see all these things? That's a derogatory statement. He's coming pretty close, if not crossing the line, to looking at this and saying, you guys are impressed with this building? Well, guess what? It's going to be torn down to the point to where every stone will not be untouched. Do you guys remember when that happened? Does anybody? 70 A.D. With a rise, a general uprising from the Jews, the Romans destroyed it. That temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. Now, it was kind of interesting to me, when Jesus was on the scene, Herod the Great had begun a process of refurbishing it and remodeling it. I think it started like in 19 BC, and it wasn't completed until 63 AD. So in other words, it was still being updated, and still being worked on when Jesus walked on the earth. So only 7 years after the renovations were completed was it torn down. The disciples might have been a little bit taken back by what Jesus said. Do you see all these things? It's going to be torn down. Now, then later in verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this thing happen? And what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? Now, I don't know if the disciples meant that they were finally understanding that Jesus was going to die and then come back. Remember, they had a hard time with that. The disciples didn't even show up on the resurrection day. And the only people that did show up were the women. And what were they there to do? Anoint the body.
Yeah, mourn and anoint.
So I don't think that they're thinking in their mind, Jesus is going to die. Oh, okay, I get it now. You're going to die and come back. I really do believe that they're still stuck in this Jewish mindset of, you're the Messiah, when is this going to happen? When are you going to become this political leader, and when is this going to happen? Anyway, he says, so when will this happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? And verse 4, now Jesus answered, first thing he's going to do, he's going to talk about birth pains. Okay? He said, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Okay, so these aren't immediate signs of his coming. Neither are the next things he's about to list. Nations will rise against nation, kingdoms against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of birth pains. Now, I have had several friends ask me, Gary, what do you think about this thing with America and with Israel, Iran, with our bombing? How does that play into the last days? I said, it's a birth pain. It is not the sign of that Jesus' coming is imminent. It's a birth pain. Guys, there's been wars and there's been rumors of wars and nations rise against nations. Did you know that in World Wars I and World War II, that people thought this is a sign of, they were really convinced, man, Hitler's the Antichrist. I'm serious. This was serious conversation going on with Christians, that Hitler's the Antichrist and that this is it. Well, guess what? It wasn't. That if you've ever been pregnant, or if you've ever been with a woman that's pregnant, there are birth pains that tells you it's coming. And so I've never had a baby, but I've been around it, and I can tell you the pains are a piece of cake versus the real thing. And so we're not in labor with the last days simply because, only because, this thing with Iran is popped up. But you just get ready. There's going to be wars, rumors of wars. There's going to be famines, there's going to be earthquakes, various places. These have been happening since the ascension of Christ. Then now Jesus is going to go to something personal with the disciples. He said, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. In other words, again, just as he predicted or prophesied the destruction of the temple, what is he prophesying now? But I think he's talking to them personally. I think he's looking at them and he's saying, you will be handled. You would be handed over. In other words, he's predicting the martyrdom of the disciples. He's getting personal right now. Then he says in verse 11, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. See, that's already happening. Well, it was happening then. That's what John said. There's Antichrist here now. And because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm to the end will be saved. I think verse 14 is a huge verse of scripture that gives us a hint, a big hint, into what our assignment is. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, then the end will come. That stands out to me as saying, in other words, the last days, the way that I've always viewed it was, I felt like I was just going to be a pawn in this string of events that were just going to start happening. And I'll tell you, when people get to feel that there are things happening beyond their control, they have a tendency to get nervous, they have a tendency to get scared, they have a tendency to withdraw. Listen, you do with your family whatever God's leading you to do, but I was talking to this guy one time that's a pretty hardcore prepper. This is probably about 15 years ago. And he saw the signs and he said, man, we got to run for the hills. We got to bunker. We got to get ready for hard times. And I said, brother, you go ahead and do that. I said, go ahead. I said, but I don't feel God calling me to run from people just simply because there's hard times coming. He said, well, you're going to be in the cheese lines, the FEMA cheese lines with the rest of everybody else. And I said, yeah, I will. I'll be standing in those cheese lines sharing Jesus with people that are afraid, that are looking for answers, and that need him. And he looked at me. Or when things have begun to happen that seem unsettling, and we can begin to get nervous. Do you guys, I deal with, I'm the director of Heart to Heart. We minister to men coming out of jail, prison, rehab, basically men stuck in addiction, coming out of addiction. And these guys, they can lose hope real quick. That life has, outrun them, or that they've missed so much. And but I'm just telling you, they need purpose. They need to see that things are not just out of control and that things are just kind of running amok out there. You see, when I know what God is doing and I see the last days, I see it happening. I agree with John. I see the last minutes. I see what's going on. And when your world's being shaken, it's very difficult to find God. Well, I think as this study begins to unfold each week by week, we're going to discover that we don't have to be afraid. We don't have to be nervous. I deal a lot with mental health issues with people because drugs and mental health go hand in hand. Do you know we're handing out more medication, more people are being diagnosed with mental health issues now than ever? Do you know that people that are on drugs or they deal with mental health have a hard time going to church? I really believe the world has become so unsettling, so unsettled, that people are seeing. We're seeing the negative impact of that. That's the reason I served on the board to bring Love Inc. into town. That's the reason we started Heart to Heart Ministries. That's the reason I'm very interested in what's going on with Day of Hope, because I see all these things in the context of what God's doing, and that if people need anything today is hope. And they find hope when they understand, oh, God's got something for me to do. You mean my life can still have purpose even though I've spent the last 20, 30 years on drugs? That's who you're going to meet that Day of Hope. You're going to meet people like the guys that we minister to. They're seriously looking for hope. So it's more than just about haircuts. It's more than just about feeding, although those are important. It's about these folks are lives. They need Jesus, and they need Jesus because, and it's just going to keep getting worse. I hate to tell you that. We're so divided politically in this country, and I lean conservative. I'll be honest, but I was in Washington D.C. I was there for 19 years. I worked with the abstinence, marriage, family education movement. I started as a consultant, ended up with being a consultant to Congress, and I was in D.C., had an office there advising Congress on these issues for a number of years. It kind of evolved into it. And so I've seen how, and I can just tell you this, is that this country, as well as every country, is going down, and it doesn't matter who's president. We're either going to go down the Democrat way, or we're going to go down the Republican way. Because really, we're going to look. That Peter says that the end time is just going to be fire and rubble. So to me, the most important part of the end of the last days is that verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. I can sink my teeth into that. That gives me an important role, an important assignment. We'll pick it up at verse 15 next week. Now, I'll give you a little hint. In verse 15, Jesus starts to get specific. We're going beyond birth pains now, and we're getting into labor, starting in verse 15. So if you want to read verse 15 through the end of the chapter for next week, that's what we'll pick up.